I was standing at the departure gate, coffee cooling in my hand, when my phone rang. The screen showed Calvin Rourke. I answered because I always did. "You're terminated, effective immediately." He didn't bother with hello. "Your risk posture is obstructive. Leadership needs someone more flexible." The words landed hard, not loud sharp. Months of logs, warnings, and escalations collapsed into a single insult. Obstructive. Calvin's favorite word for the truth. He spoke quickly, rehearsed, like he'd practiced this line until it sounded reasonable. I waited for HR. Paperwork. Anything resembling a process. Nothing. From who I asked. A pause. Then a controlled breath. "From above," he said, and hung up. "Before we continue, please wait while I find a warm blanket to wrap myself in, because it's really cold where I am. How about where you are? What's the temperature like right now? And if you're still here, leave your lucky number below so I know you're with me." I stood there, heat rushing to my face, humiliated by how casual it all felt. I lived in the world of audit logs and timestamps, the person who mapped long-term exposure before it turned expensive. Calvin lived in soft language and glossy decks. As regional operations manager, he smoothed numbers into stories executives liked to hear. He sold confidence. He ruled a small territory by speaking for people who weren't in the room. The boarding pass in my pocket had been booked weeks earlier. Termination doesn't cancel a flight. A voice on a phone doesn't erase a process. There had been no HR call, no documentation, no formal handover. Administratively, nothing was finished. Legally, neither was I. I wasn't flying to make a point or chase revenge. I was flying to complete the technical handover I'd been paid to start, to leave clean records where I always did. Professionalism wasn't weakness, it was habit. When my group was called, I boarded. The seat beside me stayed empty as the cabin filled. I buckled in, forcing the anger down into something colder. A man sat beside me as the doors closed, calm, unhurried. As he lifted his bag, his luggage tag swung into view. "Elliot Ward, Regional Vice President. We are all heading towards the same destination, the one where $31 million waited for a final unlock." What just happened was only the beginning. The next part of the story contains some fictional elements and uses AI to clarify the message and enhance the emotional experience. If you empathize, I greatly appreciate it. If not, I hope you have a peaceful evening and a good night's sleep. Looking back over the years tied to the $31 million expansion, the injustice sharpens instead of fading. I built the risk framework from the ground up, tracing dependencies, flagging weak approvals, documenting every deviation before it could metastasize into loss. My work was slow, precise, and unwelcome. Calvin Rourke, our regional operations manager, operated in the opposite direction. He arrived late to reviews, skimmed my reports, and left with smiling summaries that stripped away every inconvenient warning. Whenever I pushed back, he called it perspective. Whenever I escalated, he called it tone. He told executives he was simplifying complexity, when in truth he was burying it. I watched my cautions softened into suggestions, then edited into optimism. Each quarter, his confidence was rewarded. Each quarter, my unease grew heavier. The day he fired me, the timing finally aligned. The regional approval meeting was hours away. The final authorization for $31 million was waiting on a clean narrative. My presence, with my logs and timestamps, had become a liability. The realization tightened in my chest. I wasn't removed for being wrong. I was removed for remembering too much. By the time the cabin settled into its low, mechanical hum, my earlier anger had cooled into something deliberate. I wasn't rehearsing arguments or planning speeches. I stared forward, hands folded, breathing slow. Silence was easier to control than emotion. Elliot Ward glanced over with a polite smile. "Business trip?" he asked. "Yes." I said, "Risk integration." He nodded. "Still hands-on, I review authorization chains and long-term exposure." I replied, "I document things people prefer to forget." We spoke in fragments after that. The summit location, the compressed schedule, what happens when assumptions go untested for too long. I didn't mention the call. I didn't mention Calvin. Complaints shrink rooms, facts expand them. At cruising altitude, Elliot asked, "What brings you specifically to this review, a handover?" I said, "The work was scheduled weeks ago." He absorbed that. Eyes forward. Then, as if continuing the same thread, he asked, "Who signed off on the final authorization?" The question sounded harmless. That was what made it precise. I didn't answer quickly. I replayed the chain in my head. Every timestamp, every approval softened before it moved upward. "The regional operations manager," I said, "on behalf of leadership." Elliot frowned. Just slightly. "I don't recall seeing the original risk memo." "You wouldn't have," I said. "It was revised before it reached your level." "Something shifted then. Not tension, alignment." "I see," he said quietly. "For the rest of the flight." He spoke very little. Neither did I. Control wasn't about winning a conversation. It was about placing the right question and leaving it unanswered. As the plane began its descent, I felt no relief, only clarity. We were headed to the same destination, the same review table, the same decision point. $31 million doesn't disappear loudly. It waits, for confirmation later. By the time the wheels touched the runway, the cabin felt tighter than it had in the air. The quiet between Elliot Ward and me carried weight, the kind that presses without making noise. We stood, reached for bags, exchanged a brief nod, then followed different streams toward different exits. There was no dramatic farewell, no promise, no acknowledgement of what had been said. Elliot moved with the calm efficiency of someone used to decisions landing later. I watched him disappear into the terminal crowd, already compartmentalizing the conversation into something procedural. I headed to the shuttle. Phone still silent. No HR follow-up, no correction. The termination existed only as a voice recording in my memory. Unsupported by policy. That uncertainty hung over everything, an invisible pressure that refused to lift. The summit venue loomed ahead, glass and steel reflecting late afternoon light, somewhere inside. Folders waited, spreadsheets, signatures assumed, not questioned. I checked in, collected a badge marked Observer, and kept walking. Across the terminal, Elliot paused near a quiet corner. He didn't look around. He didn't pull out a laptop. He took his phone and made one call. "Compliance," he said when it connected. "I need a clean authorization trace on the regional expansion budget." A pause. Then, "No. Don't notify operations yet." Another pause. "Just verify the chain, quietly." He ended the call and slipped the phone away. No names, no accusations, certainly not mine. The request was neutral, almost polite, which made it dangerous. I felt the pressure settle then. Firm and unmistakable. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had shifted. Processes were moving without announcement. Questions were being asked in the right order, by the right office, at the right level. Authorization doesn't fail loudly. It stalls. It waits for confirmation that never comes. As I stepped into the elevator, badge catching the light, I understood that whatever came next would not arrive with noise, only consequences. Pressure followed me down the hallway, quiet and patient, the kind that doesn't rush, because it knows systems collapse on their own schedule eventually, every time without warning. By morning, the building felt louder than usual, though no one was raising their voice. I learned about the freeze before Calvin Rourke did, not from an announcement, but from the sudden stillness that follows bad data. Systems hesitate, calendars pause, money waits. At 9:20, an internal alert circulated through finance and compliance. Disbursement on hold pending authorization verification, $31 million, locked behind a procedural question, no explanation, no timeline. Calvin reacted exactly how I expected. His calls came fast and sloppy. He stormed down the hallway, voice cutting through glass offices. Who authorized this? He demanded. This is a timing issue. We have commitments. People nodded without answering. Panic always looks for an audience. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A message forwarded by a junior analyst who didn't know better. Calvin again. This time on email. This freeze is unacceptable. Release the funds immediately. I'm signing off. He hit send to the wrong list. Compliance replied first. Authorization under review. Please stand by. That was when the mask cracked. Calvin's confidence turned brittle. He stopped selling certainty and started begging process to move faster than it could. He blamed finance. He blamed legal. He blamed a former employee who wasn't even in the building. I watched from a distance, saying nothing. Pressure doesn't need commentary. What Calvin didn't realize was simple and devastating. The system wasn't asking who wanted the money released. It was asking who had approved it last. The trace came back clean. Too clean. Every revision, every rerouted memo, every softened warning ended at the same place. His name, his credentials, his digital signature. Calvin Rourke wasn't caught stealing. He was caught pretending authority had been implied. By early afternoon, his office door was closed. His calls went unanswered. The 31 million remained frozen. Silent proof that panic travels faster than lies. But truth, once logged, doesn't move at all. No one announced the failure. No alarm sounded. The freeze simply existed. Immovable, in that quiet. I understood something else. Authority borrowed eventually expires. And when it does, it doesn't argue. It just stops working, leaving the borrower exposed, alone, and suddenly very small. Power hates daylight, and compliance brings it every time. If you think you know what's coming for Calvin next, tell me, because every voice that speaks up helps turn quiet wrongdoing into something that can't hide anymore. I knew Calvin would fight. The freeze had cornered him. And cornered people don't reflect. They react. A remote meeting of the Human Resources Department appeared on my calendar without explanation. When I joined, Calvin was already talking. This is retaliation, he said. Voice firm, rehearsed. Maris is a disgruntled employee trying to sabotage a decision she disagreed with. I listened without interrupting. I had learned long ago that lies collapse faster when you don't rush them. HR asked questions. Calvin answered quickly, stacking confidence on top of assumption. He described me as rigid, difficult, resistant to leadership vision. He avoided mentioning logs, timestamps, or approvals. Facts complicate stories like his. When my turn came, I spoke plainly. I described my role, my responsibilities, and the sequence of events. I shared records, not opinions, emails, version histories, escalation notes, everything time-stamped, everything intact. HR scrolled in silence. My file spoke louder than I ever could. Performance reviews were consistent, compliance audits were clean, promotions documented, not a single warning, not a single complaint. The word disgruntled had nothing to attach itself to. Calvin shifted. He blamed urgency, he blamed communication gaps, he blamed interpretation. Desperation has many synonyms. Then HR asked the only question that mattered. Why was Maris terminated without HR involvement? The room went still. Calvin tried to answer. But process doesn't bend to tone. There had been no investigation, no documentation, no cause beyond inconvenience. The conclusion arrived quietly, the way real consequences do. The termination was classified as retaliatory, a response to risk disclosure, a violation of policy. Calvin didn't argue after that. He stared at the table, fighting something he could no longer control. I ended the call the same way I ended most things. Without celebration. Resistance had burned itself out, leaving only truth and the damage it causes to those who try to outrun it. By then, his resistance sounded less like strategy and more like fear, the kind that appears when authority realizes it was never truly granted in the first place. That was when I knew control had shifted. There was no all-hands review, no emergency summit. Compliance doesn't perform. It works, quietly, methodically, while others waited for instructions. They pulled archives, old logs, Version histories no one had opened in years. I stayed out of the way. Silence protects accuracy. Every system leaves footprints, and compliance knows where to look. They traced documents backward, not forward, following timestamps instead of titles. What emerged wasn't dramatic. It was consistent. Reports rewritten minutes before escalation. Risk levels softened just enough to pass. Language adjusted to sound aligned. Each edit small, defensible, forgettable, until placed side by side. The pattern mattered more than the motive. One project could be dismissed as judgment, two as coincidence. By the fourth, coincidence stopped being credible. The same revisions, the same timing, the same authorization reroute, always upward, always filtered. No one announced the findings. They didn't need to. The evidence assembled itself, clean and unemotional. A history of interference disguised as efficiency. I watched the process from a distance, connected by secure updates and short acknowledgments. No commentary, no reassurance. Cold power doesn't explain itself. Compliance stopped asking questions. That was the signal. When investigators go quiet, it means they've found what they were looking for. Silence became proof. The logs showed more than edits. They showed intent repeated often enough to remove doubt. Not a single mistake, but a habit. A method. I realized then that this wasn't about one freeze or one decision. It was about a system correcting itself after years of being bent. Cold authority doesn't rush. It waits until the record is complete. Then lets the weight of it settle where it belongs. No meeting rooms filled. No voices overlapped. No defenses rehearsed. Just files speaking in sequence. Timestamps lining up. And power moving without announcement. That kind of authority feels impersonal, almost invisible, until it finishes its work and leaves consequences behind, where systems remember long after people forget. When the first message arrived, it didn't sound like confession. It sounded like relief. A junior analyst asked for a private call. Voice low, camera off. "I just want this on record," he said. Then another request followed, and another. Silence had loosened something people had been holding tight. They spoke carefully at first. Not accusations, just sequences. He told us to revise the wording. He said leadership preferred a cleaner tone. He approved the changes himself. Each sentence aligned with the logs. Compliance was already tracing. By the second interview, the story stopped being personal. It became mechanical. 3 prior projects surfaced, spread across different years, different teams, different risk profiles. Yet the edits followed the same shape. Warnings softened. Escalations delayed. Authorization rerouted upward with just enough polish to look intentional. I listened, saying little, watching the pattern assemble. One analyst hesitated, then added, "We thought it was normal." He said this was how things got done. Another swallowed hard. He told us not to worry. He'd handle the exposure. The rooms stayed virtual. No raised voices, no arguments. Just timelines stacking beside each other until coincidence had nowhere left to stand. Compliance laid the documents side by side, and the similarities stopped being subtle. What collapsed wasn't a defense. It was an illusion. Calvin hadn't improvised. He'd repeated the same maneuver for years, adjusting language, timing, and audience, trusting distance and turnover to erase memory. When the final comparison was complete, no one sounded surprised. That was the most unsettling part. The pattern explained too much too neatly. A compliance lead summarized it without emotion. This wasn't a one-off. This was a method. The pressure I'd carried since the gate finally released, replaced by something heavier and calmer. Collapse doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it looks like understanding spreading, quietly, until there's nowhere left to hide. It marked the moment when denial failed, process prevailed, and the consequences stopped waiting. Because once patterns surface, organizations move forward, not emotionally, but inevitably, leaving those who relied on obscurity exposed to daylight alone. Calvin Rourke stopped appearing on calendars, stopped replying to emails, stopped being referenced in meetings that used to orbit his approval. Silence moved faster than any memo. By the end of the week, The suspension was confirmed. No subject line, no commentary, just a status update issued to the people who needed to know. Calvin was removed pending final review. There was no outrage, no defense mounted on his behalf. Authority, once withdrawn, leaves very little behind. The termination followed quietly. No press release, no internal statement celebrating accountability. His access was revoked, his responsibilities reassigned, his name dissolved from documents as if it had never anchored them in the first place. Organizations prefer clean endings, even when the damage was anything but. I watched it unfold from a distance, still out of state, still finishing the work I'd been sent to do before everything unraveled. Justice didn't look like victory. It looked like correction, systems returning to their intended shape. Then my phone rang. It wasn't HR. It wasn't an apology. It was a calm request. "We'd like to discuss your return," the voice said, in a revised capacity. The offer was precise. Expanded authority, direct reporting lines, independence written into the role, not implied. No more softened language passing through intermediaries. No more warnings filtered for comfort. I listened, careful not to react too quickly. Acceptance wasn't triumph. It was responsibility restored. "I'll consider it," I said. When the call ended, nothing felt celebratory. There was no applause waiting, no recognition tour, just the quiet understanding that truth doesn't need noise to land. It only needs the right structure to hold it. Calvin's story ended without spectacle. Mine continued without permission being asked. That was the difference. Justice didn't raise its voice. It adjusted the system, removed the interference, and moved forward. And in that quiet progression, something far more lasting took hold, a correction no one could spin, and a role built to ensure it wouldn't need to happen again. What disappeared wasn't the money. That became clear once the freeze lifted and the accounts balanced exactly as they should have. $31 million never left the system. It simply waited, untouched. While authority was questioned, what vanished instead was something harder to track on a ledger, a small, persistent abuse of power that had lived comfortably between departments. Protected by silence and routine, it didn't announce itself. It hid behind urgency, behind polished language, behind the assumption that someone else had checked. When it was removed, nothing dramatic followed. The work continued. Approvals flowed again. This time, clean. People adjusted without speeches or blame. Systems don't mourn interference. They correct it. I felt lighter than I expected. Not vindicated, not triumphant, just free from carrying a truth that had been inconvenient to hear. Justice, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't ask permission. It waits for alignment. Lies survive quietly until they meet the wrong person, at the right level, at the right time. Then they don't explode. They simply stop working. And when that happens, what remains isn't loss. It's clarity, restored process, and the quiet relief of knowing integrity can outlast misuse over time. I didn't win by being louder or faster. I survived by staying accurate when accuracy felt inconvenient. That's the lesson that stayed with me long after the systems unlocked and the titles changed. In real workplaces, power rarely collapses because someone makes a speech. It collapses because records exist, processes remember, and truth keeps its shape even when people try to bend it. What hurt most wasn't being fired. It was realizing how easily quiet abuse can hide inside routine, how often people stay silent because speaking feels risky, lonely, or pointless. I felt that fear too, but I also learned something else. Integrity doesn't require permission. It only requires consistency. You don't have to be dramatic. You just have to be precise. If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you stay quiet to protect comfort? Or would you document what matters and trust the system to catch up eventually? There's no easy answer. Every choice has a cost, but some costs buy clarity, and some only delay it. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? At home, on a commute, late at night after work. Wherever you are, your presence here matters more than you think. If this story resonated, Consider subscribing. One subscription helps this story reach someone who might need the reminder that doing the right thing still counts. A like, a comment, or a share can quietly change how another person sees their own situation. You're not just supporting a channel, you're helping honest stories travel farther. And sometimes, that's exactly how change starts. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.